The information and examples included in this summary presentation are designed to support the learning of the course objectives that address sampling. Now I'm going to begin this hopefully brief presentation by focusing on a specific example that illustrates the importance of sampling and its role in being able to interpret the results of a study. The name of this study is called Attitudes of American High School Students Toward People Living in Poverty. So I'm assuming from the title that they're going to be reporting the results of a survey, an attitude survey, in which they will generalize to American high school students in general, just based on the title. Now, I know in the abstract it indicates that there was a sample size of 536 American high school students. So out of the entire population of high school students, they selected 536 to participate in the attitude survey. And by the way, the attitude survey I found it pretty interesting. I'll give you some examples of a few of the items. And I'm assuming that these items were presented as Likert type scale items where you ask the survey takers to identify their level of agreement with certain statements. So here's a couple of those statements. There is a lot of fraud among welfare recipients. Poor people use food stamps wisely. Most poor people are dirty. The poor have the same opportunities for success as everyone else. Everyone, regardless of circumstances, should have health care. So those are just a few samples from probably it looks like maybe 50 items that the subjects responded to about poor. Now, one thing I do know about this sample is it was not randomly selected from all high school students across the United States. In fact, I believe it was a sample of convenience in which high school students who were I believe they were at a camp in the Northeast, possibly upstate New York, but in the region illustrated somewhere. And so that's where the high school students came from. And I highlight this because the map that you see in front of you is a map that depicts the amount of per pupil expenditure in education, in K-12 education, per pupil. And you'll notice that up in the Northeast, nearly twice as much money is spent per pupil in the Northeast as is spent in states that are really that line most of the Southeast. So it seems to me that if you're going to be measuring attitudes towards poverty from high school students, you would likely get some very different results from high school students up in that region than you would going further south. So that's a really important consideration when you want to do something like generalize the results of a survey to a much broader population. And that's a lot of the ideas and concepts in this presentation address possible sampling techniques and what you can do with it when you design and implement your studies. So suppose researchers are interested in conducting a study involving U.S. Generation Z people. So Gen Zers are those people born between the mid-1990s and early 2010s. Specifically, the U.S. Census Bureau categorizes Gen Zers as those born between 1997 and 2012. So let's say that these researchers wanted to investigate the impact of social media on the lives of Gen Zers. Now, although the researchers are interested in collecting data that could be generalized to the entire population of Gen Zers, or maybe the entire population in America, it would be impossible to collect data from the entire population. The current population of Gen Zers in the U.S. right now is estimated around 70 million. So you obviously cannot use the entire population in your study, which means you're going to have to take a sample. Now, suppose the researchers investigating the impact of social media on the lives of Gen Zers are actually some faculty and grad students at Radford University. They decide that the Gen Zers on campus would make an excellent sampling frame for their research. A sampling frame is an accessible section of the target population. In this case, the target population are all Gen Zers in America. This is a very accessible section, and it's where a sample can be drawn. In this case, Radford University is an accessible population for researchers who are faculty and grad students at Radford. And Radford, like all college campuses today, is teeming with Gen Zers. But of course, based on funding and time and limitation, not all students at Radford University who were born between 97 and 2012 could be included in this study. So a selection of students from the Radford University sampling frame would be identified, contacted, and included in the research sample. A sample represents the actual subjects selected to be in the study. These could be randomly selected people from the sampling frame or accessible units in the sampling frame, such as intact classes. You can give the survey to everybody in a class that the professor is teaching. Or they might be students in certain classes like psychology classes who have to participate in a research study as part of their course experience. Okay, so probability sampling is a technique in which every unit in the population has a chance, a non-zero probability, of being selected in the sample. And this chance can be accurately determined. So here we have a sampling frame of people, and everybody in that group has the same chance at being selected. So that's probability sampling. Now, how are they selected? Well, one way to do it would be to put everybody in the sampling frame, put all their names in a hat, and just randomly pick the names you want for your sample. That would be random sampling. You could also go online to a tool called a true random number generator, and you put in the minimum number, just a number, and then the maximum number, which should correspond to the number of people in the sampling frame, and then you generate a number randomly between those two numbers. And if you've numbered all the people in the sampling frame, then whatever number comes up, that's the person who you're going to include in your sample. So that's probability sampling with random sampling. Now, non-probability sampling is a sampling technique in which some units of the population have a zero chance of selection, or where the probability of selection cannot be accurately determined. Typically, units are selected based on certain non-random criteria, such as quota or convenience. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. So let's say that you were a researcher at Radford University, and you put up a sign-up sheet in the cafeteria to have people just randomly sign up to be in your study, whoever they are, whatever students they are. Obviously, a sign-up sheet like this would have to say, well, you need to be born between these dates. But the thing is, that wouldn't be randomly signing up, because first of all, it's only exposed to the people who are in who go to the cafeteria. So not everybody in the entire sampling frame, which would be Radford University, would have a chance at being in the sample. So let's look at some of the different types of probability sampling. Here's simple random sampling. So in this technique, all the subset of a population or of the sampling frame are given an equal opportunity of being selected. That's simple random sampling, which we presented before. Then there's stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is where the sampling frame is divided into homogeneous and non-overlapping subgroups that we call strata. For example, each class at Radford University might be considered a stratum, and so the same number of students from each class are then randomly selected to be included in the sample. Now, if you have a population that's dispersed over a wide geographic region, it may not be feasible to conduct a simple random sampling of the entire population. But in such a case, it may be reasonable to divide the population into clusters, usually along geographic boundaries if you're talking about a large space, and then you randomly sample a few clusters and you measure all the units within that cluster. In this case, the clusters are individual states, and you randomly select those states, then you randomly select cities in those states, then you randomly select a school from those cities or towns, and then you randomly select students within those schools. So that would be an example of cluster selection. So systematic sampling is a technique where the sampling frame is ordered according to some criteria, and elements are selected at regular intervals through that ordered list. For example, researchers might get a list of all students in an elementary school and rank them based on achievement, and then select every third student to be included in the sample. That way they would get a more, they would ensure that they wouldn't just by chance select all the high achievers or all the low achievers. This would give you a good cross-section of all ability levels in a particular class. So systematic sampling can be very valuable for researchers. So then there's a different way to systematically sample, and this is matched pair sampling. So let me give you an example of this. So suppose researchers want to determine how paying teachers more would affect their job performance and attitudes towards teaching. So the researchers were interested in actually proving causality, so they designed a controlled experiment to test the hypothesis that salary amount did affect teacher practice. Because based on the literature, the researchers recognized that in many elementary school settings, there are far more female teachers than male teachers, and teaching experience as well as salary are not evenly distributed between the males and females. So in order to ensure that the experimental samples include an adequate mix of teachers, matched pair sampling is used. So first, teachers are matched based on gender and experience. So matches include one male and one female teacher who both have approximately the same amount of teaching experience. Then each member of the matched pair is assigned to either the experimental group or the control group. Now, those in the experimental group receive an unexpected raise of $100,000 per year, and those in the control group receive no raise. The teachers are then observed throughout the year, and variables associated with their performance and attitudes are measured. Of course, this may not be the most ethical study, but it would definitely result in some interesting data. And of course, another research question there would be, what happens when you have that level of disparity doing the same type of job? So here we are in the last section, or types of sampling, and these are non-probability samplings, and the first is called convenience sampling. This is also called accidental or opportunity sampling, and it's a technique in which a sample is drawn from that part of the population that is close at hand, readily available, or just convenient. For instance, if you stand outside a shopping center and hand out questionnaire surveys to people or interview them as they walk in, the sample of respondents you will obtain will be a convenience sample. This is a non-probability sample because you are systematically excluding all people who shop at other shopping centers. So next we have quota sampling. In this technique, the population is segmented into mutually exclusive subgroups, just as in stratified sampling, and then a non-random set of observations is chosen from each subgroup to meet a predefined quota. So in the initial stages of a study, researchers can collect representative data from the sample formed using the quota sampling method, similar to stratified random sampling, but the researchers will then make changes within the sample based on some specific criteria. For example, researchers investigating the impact of distance learning experience on university students might create subgroups based on undergraduate and graduate status, and maybe even by major, They might then decide to only include subjects who have a certain amount of experience with distance learning to complete the study. Then there's expert sampling. This is a technique where respondents are chosen in a non-random manner based on their expertise on the phenomena being studied. For instance, in order to understand the impact of distance learning on college teachers, the researchers might only select those faculty members who have a lot of experience teaching those classes. And finally, there's snowball sampling. In snowball sampling, researchers begin by identifying a few respondents that match the criteria for inclusion in a study. These participants are then asked to recommend others they know who also meet the selection criteria. And through word of mouth, you end up collecting or obtaining all the subjects that you hope to sample. And this is a particularly important one when you're having trouble recruiting subjects for a particular study. And one way to communicate about the study is that people who do volunteer will then go tell other people about it. And that's it. So those are some of the important concepts related to sampling that you will need to understand in the class.